Hey guys, welcome back. It's Peyton Luck again here with the March Madness Bracket Battle Breakdown Episode 2. So in this episode, we're really just going to be taking a look at all the different criteria that I use to fill out my 19-20 brackets or so that I have, and talk about some of the interesting matchups we found, some of the interesting results of some of these based off those criteria that we look at. So there's 4 different kind of groups of criteria. We'll call them regions, just in honor of the tournament. So in each of those, they'll be kind of based off of different criteria that I used, as well as I've got some of my own picks that I'll probably break down in a different episode. We've got Brad, the bracket Brachiosaurus here, helping us make some picks. So we'll stick him up in the front row seat. Hopefully he brings us some good luck with some of these picks and maybe even a perfect bracket. So let's get on to the first region. All right, guys, so we're coming at you with the first region, we'll call them, of brackets that we're going to take a look at. I'm going to use my phone as like my microphone throughout this because the audio sounds really bad coming off my computer, so I'm just going to use this, sync it up in editing, but we don't have to worry about that. First is we've got these first 8 brackets, which are going to be our chalk region. For those that aren't aware, chalk is a term used to describe when you just choose the higher seed in a matchup. So 1's beating 16s, 2's beating 15s, 3's beating 14s, all the way up to the 8-9 matchup where the 8 would win, being the higher seed. So this is going to be the most straightforward of any of the brackets that we look at. You've got, all the number 1 seeds getting to the Final Four in all 8, obviously. And with those 8, there are 2 different outcomes for every, matchup, or 2 different matchups for each of those, hence why there's 8. So the first one we've got here is Gonzaga-Baylor in the final, with Gonzaga winning. And then the one after that, we have Gonzaga-Illinois, who's the other team on the opposite side of the bracket from Gonzaga, with Gonzaga winning this one as well. But the next one after that, going back to the first one, it's Gonzaga-Baylor again, but this time we have Baylor winning. And that goes for all 4 of the number 1 seeds in the tournament, so Gonzaga, Baylor, Illinois, and Michigan. We've got all 8 of those matchups, and like I said, this is a really straightforward one. There's nothing super-duper special about this. Looking at it right now, we've obviously got Illinois beating Loyola Chicago in the second round, Baylor beating UNC, Gonzaga beating Oklahoma, and Michigan beating LSU. That's just all cut and dry. So I don't know which of these I think is going to be the most likely outcome. I really like Gonzaga, and I really like Illinois is in a matchup in terms of who's the winner. I'm not really sure. Gonzaga's looked really unstoppable throughout the year, and obviously are shaping up to be one of the best teams and the team to beat in the tournament. So there's not a whole lot to talk about in this one. Like I said, it's as vanilla as you can get in terms of matchups. There's no upsets. There's no crazy things. It's the 4 best teams make it, and out of those we have 8 different results. And so we'll take a look at those throughout the tournament, see what happens. Maybe a number 1 seed loses in the first round. We've obviously seen that happen once before with UVA losing to UMBC, but we'll see if that happens. We'll see how far these number 1 seeds go and see if any of them actually come out as champion. So we're going to move on to the next region. Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to the next region here, which is what I'm going to call the record region. And so in the record region, you've got 3 different brackets. We've got number of wins, the least number of losses, and the winning percentage. And so each of those, obviously with the most number of wins, you've got the team with the most wins in the matchup will move forward into the next round. If they have the same amount of wins, I chose who had the least losses, so the best winning percentage out of that. To move forward, same with the least number of losses. You choose the team with the least losses in the matchup. Whoever has the least moves forward. Obviously, with that, kind of vice versa to the most wins, we would take whoever has the most wins if they had the same number of losses to make that comparison if you did have 2 teams that had the same amount. And then winning percentage, you take the total number of games. You take the number of wins divided by the total number of games, and with that, you find the winner. And these are all a lot more interesting than the chalk brackets we just looked at. But with these, Gonzaga still does come out on top in all 3 of them. However, their opponents that they meet up with are pretty interesting. So we're going to take a look at a couple of the different interesting matchups here in just a second. All right, so first bracket we're going to take a look at here in the record region is the number of wins bracket. So this one, just based off of who had the most wins, is going to go through in that matchup. Gonzaga does end up as the winner in this bracket, in this region, but there are a couple different interesting teams that we found in the West region, and I'll move on to the other regions as well to look at some of those in a second. So the first interesting team we have is Drake.
Drake? Drake?
With them, you have 25 wins, 4 losses, and they're playing in the play-in game against Wichita State, who would then end up facing USC in the West region. And so they end up beating Wichita State in record, who only had 16 wins, USC 22, and then end up also beating Kansas, who has 20 wins on the season, and then ends up beating the number 2 seed as well to get to the Elite Eight and face the eventual champion, Gonzaga. Gonzaga has 26 wins. That is the most in the tournament, hence why they're the champions of this bracket. But it's a really impressive run. Drake had a really good season this year, and obviously it reflects in their wins. Obviously, maybe not all against the most high-quality opponents, so obviously their seeding in this tournament reflects that. But with it, they've made their way into the Elite Eight in our fantasy bracket, and who knows, they could end up shocking the world and actually making that kind of run in the real tournament. UC Santa Barbara is our next team we like to look at. So they end up beating, in the first round, Creighton, who's the number 5 seed in the West, and then also beating the number 4 seed, UVA, right after that. UC Santa Barbara has 22 wins, finished the season 22-4, so a really strong record there. And then beating the number 5 and the number 4 seed back-to-back is a really, really strong showing for this 12 seed. So like I mentioned earlier, the 12-5 matchup always has a lot of upsets in my mind. So this could be one that could happen. UVA, if they do end up both going through, UCSB and UVA is a slow-paced team, plays a lot of really good defense, but sometimes that hurts them, where, if they can't score the ball themselves, it'll end up being a really close shootout. And, we've seen them lose some tough matchups before in the tournament, like the UMBC game. Obviously, they went on to win the next year's tournament, but you never know with UVA. It's a pretty hit or miss sometimes. So that'll be an interesting matchup to see if that actually goes through. UC Santa Barbara ends up losing in the Sweet 16 to Gonzaga, who, like I said, is just kind of run the table in this tournament. So the West region's got a couple interesting matchups to start with. Everything else is pretty normal. Missouri goes through, loses to Gonzaga. Kansas, like I said, went through. Oregon beats VCU, and then Iowa beats Grand Canyon in the 2-15 matchup. So that's the first region we're going to look at there, and we're going to come back to you with region number 2, which is the East region. All right, next up, moving on to the East region here in the number of wins bracket. We've got a couple different teams to look out for here. The first of which being UNCG, who ends up beating Florida State in the 4-13 matchup. So Florida State only had 16 wins. UNCG had 21, obviously why they would go through. UNCG would then lose to Colorado in the next matchup. But the big standout in this one is Abilene Christian, who ended up making it to the Sweet 16, where they lost to eventual regional champion Alabama. Abilene Christian was 23-4 on the season, and only just barely lost out to Alabama, who is 24-6. So a couple different interesting teams here. Not sure if they can necessarily pull this off in the actual tournament. Abilene Christian's coming up against Shaka Smart in Texas. So a really tough matchup there, and the UNCG is going up against a really strong Florida State team. So those will be two that'll be interesting to see if they kind of play out. I don't think Abilene Christian would be able to make it to the Sweet 16, but if they do, that's good news for this bracket. So nothing too super special like we saw in the previous one, but we're going to move on next to the South bracket and see what kind of shakeups we have in there. All right, next up in the South region, another one that doesn't have a whole lot going on in terms of multiple matchups, but we do have one really big standout team, and that is the aptly named Winthrop. So Winthrop coming out of the Big South Conference, which is my school, High Points Conference. So they came out the sole representative from the Big South in this tournament, but record of 23-1. They were studs all season. Watching them play against High Point and some of the other teams in our conference, they really stood out a leg above all the other teams, and obviously it shows. They were rewarded in this bracket, going all the way to the Final Four, where they lose to the Midwest regional champion Houston, which is a really interesting thing to see. Being a 15 seed. A 12 seed playing against Villanova, who obviously always comes to play in March. Jay Wright always has that team firing on all cylinders, and Villanova is one of those teams that could end up being a sleeper, end up probably making a deep run if they start hitting and firing on all cylinders. So Winthrop, obviously the team that we're going to be looking at in this region, in this bracket, but for The rest of the bracket, nothing too crazy. Utah State beats Texas Tech in the 6-11 matchup first round. Virginia Tech beats Florida, but I think that's a lot more close of a matchup than the record or the seeding shows. Virginia Tech's a really strong team, and Florida's also a really strong team, don't get me wrong, but I think Virginia Tech had a couple of hiccups in the road, but if they can come out and play their best ball, I think Virginia Tech could even make a pretty deep run to the Sweet 16 or even possibly the Elite Eight, which would be interesting to look at. So next up, we're going to go to the Midwest region, our final region, and give our kind of final breakdown for this bracket in the end. All right, and so for our final region of the bracket here, the number of wins bracket, we have the Midwest region, and I think the most interesting region out of all of these was the West, the first one we looked at. But Midwest has a pretty good standout here in Loyola Chicago, who makes it to the Elite Eight, beating not only Georgia Tech in the 8-9 matchup, which will be a close one, I think, but also beating the number 1 seed Illinois in the next matchup, and then going on to eventually lose to Houston in the Elite Eight. But Loyola Chicago is one of those teams, that has had some pretty big wins in the tournament in the past, so they're no strangers to this position, and could potentially make a pretty deep run. They're actually the number 1 team in terms of points allowed, so one of the best scoring defenses in the entire nation, actually the best. But with that, if they hold their opponents to some low shooting percentages and low point totals, they could really end up making a pretty decent run. And so that's why we're going to make Mr. Brad and certify this as Brad, the Brachiosaurus's best bet. Maybe not best bet, but I think our biggest bet. And I think this is one where Loyola Chicago in the Elite Eight, or at the very least Sweet 16, isn't that far-fetched. Their defense is going to have to come out and play really strong. But I think with that one, you could end up actually seeing them make a pretty good run. As far as the rest of the region goes, Liberty beats Oklahoma State in the 4-13 matchup in the Midwest, and Morehead State beats West Virginia.
West Virginia, Mountain Mama.
Other than that, nothing too out of the ordinary. Houston ends up the eventual regional champion here, who then faces Winthrop in the Final Four and eventually loses to Gonzaga in the national championship in this bracket. So an interesting bracket here. Like I said, a few upsets that we've gone over so far, and definitely one that has some potential to be okay. Nothing too far-fetched. I think the one that's the most out there in terms of possibilities is the Abilene Christian getting to the Sweet 16. That's one that I don't think is super likely, but I've been wrong before in many brackets, and I'll definitely be wrong again in many of the ones that we'll look at here. The next bracket we're going to take a look at is the basically polar opposite of this one. Whoever has the least number of losses goes through. So you'll see a lot of similarities in this one, but also some differences in a couple certain areas. So we're going to take a look at this one in just a second. All right, did a little camera readjustment and a little bit of a layout readjustment too. I did 4 separate recordings of the last bracket, but I figured that was going to take a little bit too much time. So we've adjusted, put all 4 here and under our little whiteboard with Brad hanging out on his little perch. But so this next bracket we're moving into is the least losses. So this one's pretty similar actually to the number of wins in a lot of ways, but there are some differences that I'm going to want to point out. The biggest similarity is that Gonzaga does get through to the championship again and wins. Obviously, they're the only undefeated team in the tournament and in the country in Division I. And so they go through easily and win their next fictional title here in this series. But so the first set of standouts we got here in the West region is Drake, who we saw in the last one as well, UC Santa Barbara again, and then Grand Canyon University as well. Grand Canyon goes on to beat Iowa in the first round and then loses to Oregon in the second. Drake gets all the way through to the Elite Eight again, and UC Santa Barbara gets through the Sweet 16, beating Creighton and UVA once again in this matchup. But like I said, in the end, Gonzaga does get through as the regional champion and ends up as the eventual representative for the Final Four and the title winner, like we mentioned. So cool to see Grand Canyon getting their win there against Iowa in this fictional matchup. Eastern Washington also pulls out a win against Kansas, which I didn't write down, but is also a very notable one to look at. So this one, the West, has got a lot of spicy matchups there. Moving on to the East, moving down, Abilene Christian actually ends up having another huge run, even bigger than their last one. They make it all the way to the Final Four against Gonzaga in this matchup. They only had 4 losses on the season, and with that, has given them, a good path to the Final Four in this situational. Then we also have Iona, who's the 15th seed going up against Alabama in this matchup. They end up winning 2 matchups, Sweet 16 bound in this situational under these criteria. Excuse me, stuttering a little there, and they end up actually losing to Abilene Christian in probably one of the more unlikely Sweet 16 matchups you'll ever see, even in a hypothetical situation. Is Abilene Christian at 14 and Iona at 15, meeting in the Sweet 16. So a couple interesting ones there. Moving on over here to the South region, we've got WIN Winthrop again, very aptly named. Didn't lose a whole lot, only once the whole season. Gets all the way through to the title game against Gonzaga, actually, out of the South region. The last one, they made it to the Final Four, lost to Houston because they had 23 wins versus Houston's 24. But at this one, they only have 1 loss, and Houston has 3. So they meet them again in the Final Four, get through, and eventually lose to Gonzaga, who obviously has those 0 losses we talked about. Another standout in this region is Colgate. So Colgate only also has 1 loss. They also have the least number of games played out of anyone in this tournament. They're 14-1, I believe. Yeah, 14-1. And the 14 seed playing against Arkansas, the number 3 seed in this matchup. So they go all the way through into the Elite 8, where they eventually lose to Winthrop. But a couple different wins there against Arkansas, Utah State, and Virginia Tech, who all make it through. So a pretty interesting matchup there again as well, with the 12 seed a 12 seed Winthrop matching up against the 14 seed in the Sweet 16 of the South region. So some cool stuff there. And then moving on to the Midwest, our final region, you've got Loyola Chicago making another Elite 8 run alongside Liberty. Making it to the Sweet 16. So Midwest has been one of the more tame regions that we've seen in this bracket hypothetical we've got going on right now. But obviously with Loyola Chicago busting out another Elite 8 win, or another Elite 8 run, they've obviously proven themselves to be, a very top-tier team. And like I said, the least points allowed on average for the entire country. So, they've definitely got potential to make a deep run if they can play some strong defense. They end up losing the Elite 8 to Houston, as I was mentioning before. Houston, the Midwest regional champion, Abilene Christian, East regional champion, Georgia out of the West, Winthrop out of the South, Gonzaga out of the West, Winthrop out of the South, and Gonzaga the eventual winner against Winthrop in the title game. The next bracket we'll be looking at is going to be winning percentage. So I'm going to do a little erasure here, put some other little notes up here on the board. We'll take a look at what the winning percentage bracket's going to shape up to look like. All right, next bracket we're going to look at is our winning percentage brackets, our final out of the record region that we're talking about. So that'll be half of our regions done, and we'll move on from that after this one. This one actually ended up being very similar to the least losses. Naturally, all of these were going to be pretty similar because they all had to do with the record, like I was mentioning before. So in this one, again, you've got Drake, UC Santa Barbara, and Grand Canyon University all pulling out some big runs there. Abilene Christian, again, to the Final Four. Like we saw in the last one, over here in the South, WIN Winthrop makes another run to the championship game, only to lose to the eventual champion Gonzaga. Obviously, with a perfect win percentage, Gonzaga tacks another win under their belt in our hypothetical bracket here. So if Gonzaga has a good run, a lot of these brackets are going to end up doing pretty well. And then also Colgate makes another run to the Elite 8, where they lose to Winthrop. And in the Midwest, like I said, probably the most vanilla of all of them. Loyola Chicago, another Elite 8 run, eventually losing to Houston, who's the Midwest regional champion. And then Liberty making a Sweet 16 run again with wins against Oklahoma State and Tennessee, losing to Loyola Chicago there in the Sweet 16. Not a whole lot to talk about on this one. It's probably going to be one of the shorter ones that I discuss, obviously because it's very similar to the least number of losses, naturally, like I said. So we're going to move on next to the scoring region, I guess is what we'll call it. So I'm going to do a little setup here, and I'll see you guys when we're back. All right, next up in our scoring region, our first bracket we're going to take a look at is our points per game bracket. So the team with the highest points per game is going to go through in these matchups. A few interesting ones here, actually some similarities to the last region we looked at, our record region. The biggest standouts first off in the West region here, Eastern Washington gets all the way to the Sweet 16, beating Kansas and Drake, losing to Iowa in the Sweet 16. And then Ohio also makes a nice run, beating Virginia, beating Creighton, the 4 and 5 seed, and then losing to Gonzaga. Once again, Gonzaga stands out in this bracket, making it all the way and winning the national championship. They have the highest, scoring output out of any team in the country, hence why they're undefeated, hence why they're the number 1 overall seed. So they pull out another one there. That's kind of what we've been seeing. Moving down to the East region, lost my marker there. We have Abilene Christian again making another surprising run, or not surprising run, excuse me. LSU makes a surprising run from the 8th seed all the way to the Final Four. So really strong performance for them in terms of point per game. Abilene Christian makes it only out of the first round, beating Texas. Still a big win, a 3-14 matchup. Everything else there is pretty standard. Colorado wins, Florida State wins. Bama goes to the Elite Eight, loses to LSU. Michigan lost to LSU in the second round of 32. So nothing super crazy there. Obviously, a couple good wins and a pretty unique champion or regional champion in LSU coming out. Moving on to the South, this is definitely where it gets the most interesting. Colgate, yet again, stands out in this region, coming away with a national championship appearance, going all the way to the title game, losing to Gonzaga. They score the ball well, and it shows there. You've got Winthrop, who makes a Sweet 16 run, beating Villanova and Purdue, and then losing to Baylor eventually. And then Oral Roberts, or Oral Bob for short. We've got them beating Ohio State in the first round, beating Florida in the second round, and then losing to the eventual regional champion Colgate in the Sweet 16. So some interesting matchups there as well. And then in the Midwest, it's kind of a toss-up. There's not really a whole lot that was pretty unique. Syracuse beats San Diego State in the 6-11 matchup, being the 11th seed. Georgia Tech beats Loyola Chicago in the 8-9. And then Rutgers beats Clemson in the 7-10 game. But all of those games, I think, are pretty evenly matched to start off with. So these aren't very unlikely things to see. Illinois does come out as the eventual regional champion, losing to Colgate in the Final Four. But I think if we're going to bring out little Brad the Brachiosaurus again, I think this is going to be Brad's best bet for this bracket here, this region at least. Is that the Midwest region as a whole looks like it could be a pretty solid in terms of our scoring, which I'll get to towards the end of the video here. Looks like they could get some good points. Illinois being the number 1 seed, making it all the way to the Final Four, faced off against Houston in the Elite Eight. You've got Oklahoma State making a run as the 4 seed, so nothing too far-fetched there. Obviously nothing like the South region or the West region where we see some pretty unlikely candidates making their way. But this bracket, like I said, Gonzaga makes another championship run, wins the title game against Colgate, and is really starting to push themselves away as the statistically the favorite for this tournament. So the next one we'll be looking at is the opposite, the points per game allowed. So whoever's got the best defense is going to be the eventual champion. So we'll have a little talk about that one once I do a little setup. Okay, guys, next up in our scoring region, we have our points per game allowed bracket. So this is going to be a very defensive-heavy bracket. The best defenses are going to win. And this is probably the most unique of our brackets that we're going to see today, I think, in my opinion, for a couple of reasons. So starting with our little breakdown, looking overall before going to any specific region, App State, Hartford, Mount St. Mary's, Drexel. That's 4 16 seeds that all end up winning their first round matchup just based off of their scoring defense. So a really, really interesting thing to see there. This makes this also probably the least likely bracket to do the best or to end up doing okay. I think this will probably end up being the worst bracket of the bunch, which says a lot because there's a couple pretty interesting brackets when we get to some of the next region that we're going to look at, or our last region. But moving just kind of more specifically, App State, like I mentioned, ends up actually making a Sweet 16 run, winning their play-in game against Norfolk State, beating Gonzaga, the number 1 overall seed, and then beating Oklahoma in the next round, where they eventually lose to the University of Virginia, who obviously has one of the best defenses in the country and has had one of the best defenses in the country for a long time. Also in this region, you've got GCU making an Elite Eight run, beating Iowa, the 2 seed, VCU, who's obviously got a very good defense, as I would know firsthand being a University of Richmond fan. And big shout out to Mike Rhodes, head coach over there at VCU, who's had a great season, A10 Coach of the Year, and has led them to a really, really good season, and obviously a berth in the tournament. But they end up losing to Grand Canyon University in this hypothetical matchup. Grand Canyon's obviously got a really good defense as well, and makes it all the way to the Elite Eight, where they lose to UVA. UVA is the West Region champion, and they only make it to the Final Four, where they lose to our East Regional champion in St. Bonaventure. St. Bonaventure beating the number 8 seed LSU in their first game and making a run all the way, beating Mount St. Mary's, who's the 16 seed representative, who beat Michigan after winning their play-in game against Texas Southern. They make it into that second round there. Abilene Christian makes another good run as well, as we've seen them do in a couple of the other brackets before, all the way to the Elite Eight, where they lose to St. Bonaventure eventually. And St. Bonaventure, another A10 opponent that came up against my favorite Richmond Spiders. Really strong defense, really good team coming out there. They end up making it into the national title game, which is really, really cool to see in this hypothetical. Iona also picks up a first-round win, as well as UNCG in the East region. So this is probably one of the most interesting regions we'll see in any of these brackets that we're looking at. And for that reason, I think we're going to label this one Mr. Brad the Brachiosaurus. This is going to be his bad bet. Not best bet, but a bad bet. Definitely don't take any advice you see on any of this bracket, at least in terms of long-term payoff, because they definitely aren't the best the best picks here. Obviously, with 4 16 seeds making pretty decent runs. All of them except for one making it into the second round. Very unlikely. We've had in over almost 140 games, only one number 16 seed winning. Now here in this, we've got 4. So very unlikely. That's why it's Brad's bad beat of this region, and probably of the entire kind of series we're going to be looking at here. Moving on to the South region, we've got Hartford beating Baylor, the number 1 seed, and making it all the way into the second round after they beat, into the Sweet 16 after they beat Wisconsin, the number 9 seed. North Texas is another standout. North Texas actually ends up making it to the Final Four, beating Purdue, Winthrop, and Hartford, and then also Utah State to make it into the Final Four for this round. So a pretty interesting one there as well. Colgate also gets out here. Virginia Tech, Ohio State is a matchup you see there, and Utah State also beats Texas Tech in the first round. So a lot of upsets in this one as well, but like I said, it's all based on defense and nothing else. So all hypothetical here in this series. Moving on to the Midwest region, Drexel stands out, obviously being the 4th and final 16 seed to pull out a win in their first round matchup, them beating Illinois. They end up losing to Loyola Chicago, who makes the run all the way into the title game and wins the national championship here. I mentioned in one of the earlier regions that Loyola Chicago has the number 1 scoring defense in the country, obviously with points per game being allowed. The statistic or criteria we're working with here, they beat St. Bonaventure in the national championship game and win a national title here. So if they make a deep run, this bracket could end up doing better than we expect, but I really don't expect in this one to get very far. Out of our Final Four, UVA seems like the only one that's actually anywhere likely to actually make that kind of run. There are some teams that could end up making, decent runs. Like I said, we were saying before, Loyola Chicago could end up making a Sweet 16 or Elite 8 run just based off how strong their defense is. But overall, this is a very, very funny bracket to look at. Interesting to see how strong defenses are, but also, some of the lower seeded teams have really relied on that defense to help get them through. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out when they get to some stronger competition, especially when you've got teams like App State going up against the number 1 scoring offense in the league. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the real tournament. So we'll keep an eye on that as we're moving through. Next up, we're going to go on to the scoring margin bracket, which we'll look at after a little bit of setup. Rounding out the scoring region here, we have our scoring margin bracket. So in this one, whoever has the highest scoring margin will end up going through in these matchups. This is where I'm going to take time to, one, apologize about my handwriting if it's been hard to read throughout this whole thing. It's just me right on the board, and then I realize, you've got to watch it through a video. So it might be a little more difficult there, but hopefully my explanations have helped out there. And also all the statistics that I'm getting for using for all of these are coming directly off of NCAA's website. So that's where I'm getting all that info if you guys wanted to check on that yourself. But starting off in this one, it's actually pretty fairly normal for the most part. There's some interesting standouts like we see here on the board. Gonzaga ends up winning this one again. They've got the highest scoring margin, so that's chalk up another one for Gonzaga. And this one, like I said, we'll go over that one at the end of this whole thing. And so we're going to take a look here at the West region first. Grand Canyon University makes an Elite Eight run, loses to eventual champion Gonzaga. UC Santa Barbara, again, makes a Sweet 16 run, and Drake also a Sweet 16 run. So some pretty interesting matchup there. Eastern Washington also gets out of the first round against Kansas, which is also interesting to see there. But moving on to the East, another one that's pretty normal. Michigan wins, St. Bonaventure, Colorado, Florida State, BYU, UConn, and Alabama. The big standout, Abilene Christian, yet again. I feel like I've mentioned them a lot so far. So maybe that's a team to watch in the tournament. Who knows? They make a Final Four run, losing to Gonzaga in the Final Four. So another big standout run for them in this hypothetical. So, fingers crossed, maybe with one of these brackets, Abilene Christian will be the difference maker for us, going all based off these statistics. Moving up into the South region, we have Winthrop, Winthrop yet again, coming out and making a Sweet 16 run, beating Villanova and North Texas. North Texas also stands out, getting their win against Purdue in the 4-13 matchup here in the West. Colgate, yet again, makes another run into the Elite Eight, losing to the eventual regional champion, who is Baylor. So a number one seed finally coming out on top. I feel like I haven't mentioned Baylor's name since we were looking at our chalk region, which is good to see them back in the light. But otherwise, that region's pretty normal. Utah State gets a win against Texas Tech in that 6-11 matchup. Marbles in my mouth over here. Virginia Tech beats Florida. Ohio State beats Oral Roberts, or Oral Bob, like we like to say. And then Virginia Tech actually makes a Sweet 16 run in this one as well. So shout out my Hokies over there. Definitely a really solid team, and definitely one of those teams that has a chance of making a good run. Moving on to the Midwest, Loyola Chicago and Liberty seem to be the two characters that always stand out in this region. Loyola Chicago makes it to the Elite Eight, loses to the eventual regional champion in Houston. Houston actually makes it into the title game against Gonzaga, where they lose. Another standout in this one is Liberty, making another Sweet 16 run. So really good, solid, kind of mixed up bracket we have here. So you got some that'll actually end up happening, with Gonzaga potentially making the Final Four, but you got some that likely aren't going to happen, with Abilene Christian also making it to the national semifinal. So a lot of variety in this one. Definitely one that we'll keep an eye on, because they're, based on how many upsets there are or what kind of upsets, we could end up having a lot of these come true. So it'll be interesting to see. We'll keep our eye on that. And so we'll head on to our last bracket region that we'll be looking at, and this will probably be one of the favorite ones that I'm looking at, because it's all based off of random selections and such. So I'll talk a little bit more about that once I get it set up. All right, coming in with our next and final, actually, region for our little bracket battle we've got going on here. We've got our random region. So I have two brackets in this one. One, I chose a random number between the seeds that matched up. So a random number between 1 and 16 using a number generator that I found on Google. So if it was a 13, 14, 15, or 16, somewhere in there, one of those numbers that's closer to 16, the number 16 seed would go through. If it was, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere around there, the number 1 seed would go through. So pretty straightforward. Luckily, didn't have any teams that had the same ranking come up against one another, because I don't know what I would have really done there. So that made my job a little easier. And then the other ones are just pretty traditional coin flip. Each team is the side of the coin, and you pick it based off of that one. But we're going to start off on the random numbers bracket. The first one team that stands out is out of the West, with Ohio making it to the Elite Eight, where they eventually lose to Iowa. So a really cool standout for them. They beat Creighton, UVA, not in that order, UVA, Creighton, and then Oklahoma in their run to the Elite Eight in this hypothetical. Iowa, like I said, makes that Final Four run as the regional champion out of there, where they lose to the eventual national champion in Georgetown, coming out of the East. Georgetown's actually the national champion in both of these brackets, which I found pretty interesting since they were randomly selected. But also Mount St. Mary's stands out as a Sweet 16 run. We mentioned them a little earlier, but I also like to give a shout out to their women's team and Arne Taylor, who I went to high school with. Congratulations to them for winning their conference tournament and punching their ticket to the national championship, or to the national tournament, on the women's side of things, as well as shout out to the High Point women's basketball team, first ever national tournament appearance. And actually ends up playing against one of the best teams in the country in UConn. So tough battle for them, but if anyone can do it, I think they can. So go Panthers. Hopefully they have a good win there. Continuing on the East region, Abilene Christian makes another Sweet 16 run. We've seen them make some pretty improbable runs in some of these brackets so far. So potentially another good bracket if they make a good run here. The South region, nothing too crazy. North Texas picks up a first-round win, Colgate as well, and Oral Roberts in the 15-2 matchup against Ohio State. A lot of first-round upsets there, but the rest of it's pretty normal. Villanova gets through the Elite Eight. Texas Tech is the champion out of this region for the random numbers bracket, so that's not the most likely thing, but definitely not out there. Mac McClung, a lot of different other transfers for Texas Tech makes them a really strong team, and they could end up shocking some people and making a deep run. Who knows? But then moving on into the Midwest, a couple standouts. Georgia Tech making it to the Final Four as the regional champion out of the Midwest, and Cleveland State, the Vikings.
Hinga-dinga-durgan.
Getting their first-round win, second-round win, and Sweet 16 win all against their opponents there, where they eventually lose to Georgia Tech. So some standouts there. The national championship game ends up at Georgetown, Texas Tech, where Georgetown gets the W and pulls out a national championship win under head coach Patrick Ewing. So maybe he can replicate some of the success he had as a player, as a coach as well. So we'll see how that shapes up throughout the tournament. Next up, we've got our coin flip bracket. This one's all over the place. You got some pretty likely things to happen, some very unlikely things to happen. The most notable of which, we have 3 16 seeds all moving on to the first out of the first round matchup they have. So pretty unlikely there, but it'll be interesting to see if there are any big 1 versus 16 upsets this year, like we've seen with UVA and UMBC in the past. Next up, we have Wichita State making a Sweet 16 run out of the West. Out of their first 4 game against Drake, they end up then beating USC, Eastern Washington, and then losing to Iowa. Iowa comes out as the West regional champion here in this coin flip bracket. Mount St. Mary's, like I mentioned before, makes it out of their first round game against Michigan, losing to St. Bonaventure in the second round matchup. Georgetown, another national title win in this criteria of bracket. So I'll be interested to see how well the Hoyas end up do in this tournament this year. UCLA gets to the Sweet 16. Alabama gets the Elite 8. A lot of different teams to mention in there, but nothing too crazy other than that Mount St. Mary's win up at the top of the bracket. We have Hartford beating Baylor in the South region. They also end up beating UNC. First time I mentioned UNC in this video, I'm pretty sure, but you got to shout out my man Armando Baycott from RVA. Played against him in high school a couple of times, so hopefully he can, make a difference there on the court, and hopefully UNC can make a deep run. I always like to watch him play, and wishing him the best of luck with his team here in this tournament. Also in the South region, Winthrop and North Texas as some standouts, like you see here. North Texas making it all the way to the Elite 8, as well as you've got Virginia Tech and Ohio State both getting through. Arkansas is the eventual regional champion out of the South in the coin flip bracket, where they will end up playing the standout from the Midwest region, which is Oregon State. Another shout out going out there to Corvallis, my uncle and aunt Andy and Jen, and my cousin Emma. Shout out to them. Always love seeing them. Hopefully those Beavers can pull out a big win there and make it to the national championship game. We'll see. Another big standout there is Syracuse making it to the Elite 8, beating San Diego State, Morehead State, and Clemson on their way to that Elite 8 run. So this is the last of our bracket regions we're going to do. I'll wipe all this down, and we'll do a little breakdown here at the end and talk about some of the things I saw in the bracket and what I think is the most likely and what's going to do best in this competition. So I'll see you in just a sec. All right, guys, so little wrap up here. I know this is a pretty long video. It obviously had a lot of breakdown and stuff to talk about there. The other ones will be a lot shorter, but I really appreciate if you guys stuck all the way through in this one. I wanted to briefly talk about my scoring system that I'm going to be doing for this. It's pretty uniform with what you'll find at a lot of other tournament challenges that you do online, so ESPN, the NCAAs, all that kind of stuff. It's all pretty much the same. So in the round of 64, you get 1 point for every correct victory or correct pick. Round 2, you get 2 points. In the Sweet 16, you get 4. In the Elite 8, you get 8 points. In the Final Four, you get 16 for every correct matchup that you pick, or correct game that you pick, and then the title game you get 32 points for picking the correct victor. So that's how the scoring is going to be done. We'll score the brackets as the games go on, so I'll do probably one each day for the first couple rounds. So that'll be the 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd for the first 2 rounds of competition. And then after that, I'm just going to do one per round. So one for the Sweet 16, one for the Elite 8, one for the Final Four, and then the title game. And then probably a wrap-up video at the end, just kind of talking about all of what we've seen and how the brackets did and what the eventual best bracket was. So moving on into that, we've got Brad, the Bracket Brachiosaurus, back, and he and I are going to make our pick for what we think is our best bracket, and the most likely to do best in the real world as well. And for that, we've picked either chalk number 5 or chalk number 2. That's not super exciting. Obviously, you've got a lot of cool things that we've written up on the board here, showed a lot of cool matchups that happened. You know, you had one of the brackets where all the 4-16 seeds went through into the second round, which is really, really interesting to see. But I looked at those for a little while and then really just kind of ended up picking these chalk brackets because they just seem the most likely to do okay. Everything else has some pretty unlikely matchups at points, whether it's, Grand Canyon University getting to the Elite Eight, or just some other teams making some kind of improbable runs. So in these two brackets, we've got Gonzaga and Illinois as our 2 title games. So I think those are 2 of the most likely in my mind that we'll see. But who knows? I could be wrong. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. So it'll be interesting to see how this tournament plays out, see what kind of upsets we have, and see what kind of things we'll see throughout. So obviously we'll be checking in every day for the next, not every day, but day to day for the next few weeks. Talking about what kind of matchups we saw and what kind of games we saw and how these brackets end up doing. I think there's, like I said, 19 in total. So a lot of brackets to look over, a lot of games to watch. And I'll be scoring those and making videos throughout the week. So hopefully you guys stay tuned. If you really like this, please share it. Invite your friends to watch. Leave a like if you'd like. That'd be really greatly appreciated. So I appreciate you guys for tuning into this one. Like I said, a long one. But if you stuck in the whole time, I really appreciate you. And I'll see you guys in the next one.